Most people think a taxable brokerage account is where you go to get more freedom. That is true. It is also where a lot of people quietly kill their compounding, and that is the part they miss. They think the danger in investing is usually dramatic. A crash, a recession, a bubble, a fraud, a terrible stock pick. Those things matter, but a taxable brokerage has a different kind of danger. It punishes carelessness in slow motion. It lets you feel intelligent while leaking efficiency. It lets you collect income that feels satisfying while taxes quietly take a bigger bite than you expected. It lets you hold the wrong asset in the wrong place for years and call it investing while the structure keeps working against you. That is why I have never thought taxable investing was a casual subject. A retirement account can forgive a lot. A taxable account forgives much less inside a 401k, an IRA, or a Roth IRA. The machine is built to shelter or defer the tax pain in ways that help compounding do its work inside a taxable brokerage. Your decisions become taxable events in real time. Sell for a gain and the government notices collect a dividend, and the government notices reinvest that dividend and think you somehow escaped taxation, and the government notices anyway. The file you gave me is absolutely right to start there. It says the biggest difference between retirement accounts and taxable brokerages is taxes, and it explains directly that dividends inside the taxable account can still generate taxes even if you reinvest them. Fay file a site Fay turn 28 file 1 Fay turn 28 file 3 Fay. That is not trivia. That is the battlefield. Once you understand that, you stop asking childish questions like what ETF looks best right now and start asking adult questions like what kind of tax character does this ETF create? What role does it play? And how much of my long-term compounding will survive after tax? That is the shift. And most people never make it. They stay mesmerized by yield. Yield is one of the easiest drugs in investing because it feels concrete. Price appreciation is abstract, a line on a chart, a theoretical gain until you sell. Yield feels like money in the hand, monthly cash, quarterly cash, something happening, something visible. That is why so many people fall in love with high-yield ETFs without understanding what they are actually collecting. The source file gives an excellent example with JEPQ. It says flatly that while the yield looks attractive, much of the payout is ordinary income rather than qualified dividend income, which makes it generally inefficient in a taxable brokerage and much better suited to tax. Advantaged accounts such as IRAs and 401ks Fay file site Fay turn 28 file 1 Fay turn 28 file 3 Fay. That single detail is more valuable than 100 hot takes because it teaches the right lesson. Not all income is good income in all places. The same fund can be sensible in one account and sloppy in another. That is why taxable investing is not just about which fund you like. It is about location, role structure, sequence. Tax character, a man who buys a high-yield fund in a taxable account because the payout makes him feel clever, may be doing something very unclever. The gross number can look impressive, the after-tax reality can be much uglier. And that is one of the deepest truths in this whole subject. Gross is vanity, after-tax is reality. That is what I care about. What survives, what compounds, what keeps working after the tax system, the account structure, and time have all taken their turn. That is why I like the way your source organizes the taxable brokerage. It does not just throw out 5 random tickers like party favors. It creates categories, jobs, roles. That is how an adult should think. A taxable account should not be a junk drawer of ETFs. It should be a machine where every part has a purpose. The first purpose is value and qualified dividend exposure. That is already a more intelligent category than high income. The file gives SCHG, VIM, and VTV as the main choices here and explains the distinction nicely. SCHG leans more toward stronger dividend cash flow. VTV leans more toward lower dividend tax drag and potentially more appreciation. Fay file site Fay turn 28 file 5 Fay. That is a real distinction, and I think it matters more than people realize, because when people hear dividend ETF, they often stop thinking after the word dividend. They imagine the job is simply to pay them. That is not the full job. In a taxable brokerage, the job is to provide exposure to steadier companies, useful qualified dividends, some downside ballast, and better tax behavior than the flashy alternatives. A value or qualified dividend sleeve is not there to impress anyone. It is there to make the whole account more durable. Durability is one of the most underrated investing virtues in the world. Investors love excitement. Wealth loves durability. Now, cash inside a taxable brokerage is another place where lazy thinking shows up. Most people toss idle cash into whatever default money market the brokerage offers and call it a day. That is not crazy. The file says money markets are often a perfectly reasonable place to hold cash, while also noting that yields are rate sensitive and can come down when the Fed cycle turns. But then it makes a sharper point. SCHG can be especially attractive, particularly for someone in a high-tax state, because of the state tax advantages of Treasury bill-style income. The source explicitly says that is why it likes SCHG for cash. Fe turn 28 file 5 Fe. This is exactly the kind of small structural edge that builds adult portfolios. No one decision like that changes your life overnight. 20 years of similar decisions might. And the same logic explains why the source pushes traditional bond ETFs out of the taxable brokerage. It says clearly that bond ETFs are primarily taxed on interest income distributed monthly as ordinary income, so they are generally not the right fit in a taxable account. Fe turn 28 file 0 Fe turn 28 file 5 Fe. This is where people confuse safety with intelligence. Something can be lower volatility and still be clumsy after tax. Something can feel responsible and still be structurally poor. That is why account location matters. A lot of investors would do dramatically better if they simply stopped asking, is this asset good? And started asking, is this asset good here? That is a higher level question. And then we come to the core. The foundation, this is where I want the taxable brokerage to stop being a toy and become a wealth engine. The source does the right thing here by making the foundational sleeve the SP 500 or total U.S. stock market bucket through funds like VOO and VTI. It even leans into the long historical resilience of broad market exposure, describing how those who stayed in foundational ETFs through crash after crash ultimately recovered and moved to new highs. Fe turn 28 file 0 Fe turn 28 file 5 Fe. That is the lesson I trust most. Not because history gives guarantees, because history teaches proper humility. A broad market ETF is the grown-up answer to a question most investors secretly keep trying to outsmart. How do I build wealth without requiring myself to be a genius? The answer is broad ownership, low cost, long patience, minimal ego. Let the productive machinery of the market work on your behalf. The source also makes a very Buffett-like point when discussing similar SP 500 funds. If two ETFs are tracking the same index, then the deciding factor is often the fee. Fe turn 28 file 0 Fe turn 28 file 2 Fe. That is exactly right. There is no glory in paying more to own the same thing. The market does not care which ticker feels fancier to you. It cares what you own and what it costs you to keep owning it. That is how rational investors think. Now, if the taxable brokerage had only one category, I would still want it to be the broad U.S. foundation. But life is more interesting than one category, and sensible diversification does matter. That is where VXUS enters. The file handles international diversification with the right attitude. It recommends VXUS for broad non-use exposure. Notes that international did outperform in certain recent periods, especially in 2025, but emphasizes that over long stretches it has generally underperformed the U.S. market and therefore should usually remain a smaller percentage used for diversification rather than domination. Fe turn 28 file 2 Fe. That is the kind of nuance I appreciate. International is not a hero, it is a helper. Its role is not to save your portfolio from ignorance. Its role is to broaden the ownership map and reduce the risk of having every equity dollar tied only to one national market. That is useful, but adults know the difference between useful and central. Then comes broad growth. This is where many investors begin to get stupid because they confuse broad growth with a speculative identity. The source does not do that. It puts QQQM in the broad growth category and mentions SCHG and VOO as excellent lower fee alternatives. Fe turn 28 file 3 Fe. That is smart because broad growth still belongs to the portfolio core. It is still diversified enough to remain part of a durable machine. It just gives you more weight in the parts of the market that have historically produced stronger growth and more upside. That matters because broad growth and foundation are not the same thing. Foundation says endurance. Broad growth says acceleration. You do not need both in every exact proportion, but it is very useful to know they are serving different emotional and structural jobs. VOO or VTI gives you the steady backbone. QQQM or SCHG gives you more direct participation in the engines of expansion. That is not gambling. It is a tilt. Adults know the difference between a tilt and a bet. And then, if you insist on having a little more fire in the machine, the source gives a final category for aggressive growth. It treats it exactly the way it should be treated. Smaller optional, higher risk. It mentions SMH, XME, IBIT, and then says it personally prefers VGT in that aggressive bucket because it still offers strong upside while remaining broader and less fragile than the narrower alternatives. Fe turn 28 file 3 Fe. This is the part people abuse most. They take what should be a small optional sleeve and make it the emotional center of the account. That is how taxable brokerages turn into casinos with tax forms. A small aggressive sleeve can be fine. A taxable account built around aggressive excitement is usually a mistake. The speculative bucket should remain proportionate enough that if it gets cut in half, it does not force you into panic, selling, or years of psychological damage. That is what proportion means, and that is why I appreciated that the file did not stop at categories. It went further and proposed model allocations for different kinds of investors. For the younger, higher-risk investor, the source suggests a structure with SHGD, VOO, VXUS, QQQM, and VGT. FE file site, FE turn 28, file 3, FE. I understand the appeal. It says, I want broad ownership, some qualified dividend ballast international diversification. And more upside than a pure vanilla account that is reasonable for someone with decades ahead, tax flexibility, and emotional room to handle swings. The important point is not the exact percentages. It is the logic. Even a younger investor should still have structure. Youth is not permission to be reckless. Youth is the gift of time. Time is most powerful when paired with broad compounding, not when wasted trying to prove bravery. For the investor in the 40s or 50s, the source becomes more nuanced. It shifts the value sleeve from SAG toward VTV to reduce dividend tax drag while still maintaining safer value exposure. Then uses VOO, VXUS, South Carolina HG, and a smaller VGT allocation, FE file site, FE turn 28, file 3, FE. That is exactly the sort of shift a mature investor should be willing to make. Same account type, different life problem, higher earnings, more sensitivity to taxes, more need for efficiency, less desire to let unnecessary distributions create recurring friction. That is what growth in investing really looks like, not new tricks, better structure. And for the lower risk investor near or in retirement, the file leans back into SAG for cash flow. Keeps VOO and VXUS for core and diversification, adds modest broad growth like bug, and removes the more aggressive final sleeve. FE file site, FE turn 28, file 3. FE again, the wisdom is not that every retiree should own these exact weights. The wisdom is that retirement changes the job description. Cash flow matters more. Emotional tolerance for volatility matters more. The account is no longer just a compounding engine. It may also be part of a bridge, part of a spending system, part of a tax-aware withdrawal plan, and that is why I think this entire subject can be summarized in one sentence. A taxable brokerage is a freedom account, but freedom without structure becomes leakage. The account is useful because it is flexible. It can fund early retirement bridges. It can hold long-term wealth outside retirement plans. It can create optionality. It can serve major future goals. But because it is flexible, it requires more discipline, not less. You need to respect tax character. You need to know when yield is helpful and when yield is just expensive theater. You need to know which sleeve is foundational, which sleeve is diversification, which sleeve is broad growth, and which sleeve is speculation. You need to understand why some assets are better held in tax-advantaged accounts and why some are especially useful in taxable. That is what makes the portfolio intelligent, not the ticker symbols by themselves. The architecture. This is why I would never define the best ETFs for a taxable brokerage as the most exciting 5 funds on the market. That is childish. The best ETFs for a taxable brokerage are the ones that let you build the right roles in the right proportions while minimizing tax drag and protecting after-tax compounding. That is the grown-up definition, and in the end, that is what taxable investing is really about. Not finding a magical ticker, not chasing the loudest yield, not confusing motion with intelligence. It is about protecting compounding from your own carelessness. That is the real enemy. Carelessness with taxes, carelessness with account location, carelessness with income type, carelessness with structure, carelessness with role. A man can earn excellent market returns and still build a mediocre taxable account if he is careless in those ways. Another can own a quiet, boring, disciplined set of ETFs and build something extraordinary simply because he respected how the machine works. I have always preferred machines that work. They do not brag, they just compound. There is another reason I distrust yield obsession in taxable brokerages. It trains the investor to focus on what feels good this month instead of what compounds best this decade. That is a terrible habit. A taxable account is one of the few places where impatience and tax drag can cooperate against you in the same sentence. You can buy something with a giant payout because it feels productive and then discover you created a recurring tax bill on income you never truly needed in the first place. You can keep reinvesting those payouts and still owe tax on them every year. You can mistake activity for optimization. You can build an account that is busy but not efficient. That is how many adults end up with portfolios that look rich and behave mediocrely. They are collecting distributions they do not need, paying taxes they could have deferred, and congratulating themselves because a cash number arrived on schedule. The schedule is not the point. What survives is the point. That is one reason I actually think the broad market core is even more important and taxable than many people admit. A broad market core is not only about return potential, it is also about elegance, low turnover, broad exposure, reasonable distributions, fewer moving parts. The more moving parts you add to a taxable account, the more chances you give yourself to leak efficiency through bad location, unnecessary complexity, emotional tinkering, or taxable events that never needed to happen. I like simple things that survive long enough to become extraordinary. That is why VOO and VTI matter so much. The source treats them as foundational, and that is exactly right. Foundation means the account can still make sense even if your opinions are wrong for a few years. Foundation means you do not need every narrow thesis to work. Foundation means that when the world gets noisy, you still own the productive center of the market. It means you are participating, not constantly auditioning to be clever. Fay Phalocite, Fay turn 28, file 0, Fay turn 28, file 2, Fay. A surprising number of people ruin taxable investing by wanting too much personality in the account. A personality-driven portfolio is usually a fragile portfolio. One fund because they heard a podcast, another because an influencer likes the monthly income, another because semiconductors seem unstoppable, another because international has to mean reversion, another because Bitcoin makes them feel early, another because value has to come back. None of these pieces are necessarily insane by themselves. What is insane is when the account becomes a crowded room of half convictions, all competing for emotional importance, none clearly assigned a role. That is why categories matter so much. Value and qualified dividends are one role, cash and short duration safety are another. Broadest ownership is another, international diversification is another, broad growth is another, aggressive sector or theme exposure, if any, is the last and smallest role. Once you understand roles, you become much harder to fool. A high-yield ETF can no longer seduce you by yield alone, because you ask what job are you doing here and what tax cost comes with that job. A bond fund can no longer seduce you with safety alone, because you ask whether the safety belongs in this account or in a tax-sheltered one. A technology sleeve can no longer seduce you into becoming the whole portfolio because you know its role is acceleration, not foundation. That is what good architecture does. It strips away confusion. It also strips away a great deal of ego. There is something very healthy about building a taxable brokerage where you know exactly why each sleeve exists. It becomes harder to make a foolish purchase in a moment of market envy because the account no longer feels like an identity project. It feels like a machine. Machines are easier to respect than personalities. Now, I want to say something important about age because the source does an unusually good job of refusing one-size-fits-all advice. Most ETF content online acts as if every investor lives in the same tax bracket, the same decade of life, and the same emotional reality. That is nonsense. The correct taxable brokerage for a 28-year-old engineer trying to maximize long-run growth is not necessarily the same as the correct taxable brokerage for a 52-year-old high earner building a bridge to early retirement, and neither is the same as the correct taxable brokerage for someone who wants additional liquidity and tax-aware income near retirement. The source handles this by showing different allocations for different circumstances. Fay Phalocite, Fay turn 28, file 3, Fay. That is exactly the way adults should think. Context first, ticker second. A younger investor can usually afford more broad growth than a modest aggressive sleeve because time is still doing most of the heavy lifting and because taxes, while still relevant, may not yet be as punishing if current income is lower. That does not mean the young investor should become reckless. It means he can let the account lean more toward acceleration without abandoning structure. The source S younger model using SCHG, VOO, VXUS, QQQM and VGT reflects that logic. Well, Fay Phalocite, Fay turn 28, file 3, Fay the middle. High earner is a different creature altogether. This person may already be maxing retirement accounts, already facing a more meaningful marginal tax rate, already thinking about optionality rather than just accumulation for that investor. The file S shift toward VTV over SHG is exactly the kind of subtle move that reveals maturity. The investor is not anti-dividend. He is pro-efficiency. He wants less dividend drag, somewhat more appreciation, still some ballast, still some value, but in a way that respects the tax reality of his current life. That is adult investing. Not louder, sharper Fay Phalocite, Fay turn 28, file 3, Fay turn 28, file 5, Fay. And the investor near retirement has another set of needs entirely. He may want a taxable account that works more like a flexible side bucket than a pure growth engine. Maybe this account helps supplement retirement spending. Maybe it serves as a bridge before required retirement distributions. Maybe it simply gives him a place to own assets with more accessibility and psychological comfort. In that case, cash flow and ballast deserve more respect. The source S lower risk model leaning more heavily into SCHG while still keeping VOO. VXUS and a modest growth sleeve understands that Fay Phalocite, Fay turn 28, file 3, Fay, and I want to underline something very important here. Taxable brokerage investing is not the same thing as retirement income planning. Those topics touch each other, but they are not identical. One of the reasons investors get so confused is that they blur the language of accumulation, the language of tax efficiency, and the language of retirement paycheck design into one giant emotional soup. The result is often a portfolio built for none of the jobs particularly well. The dividend file in your uploads makes a useful companion point here. It explains that dividends are one tool in a total return flexible tax-aware plan, not the entire plan itself. It also stresses that qualified dividends and long-term capital gains often share similar tax rates, while capital gains give you something dividends do not always give you. Timing control. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 28 file, 6 Fay-Turn 28 file, 8 Fay-Turn 28 file, 10 Fay. That timing control matters enormously. A taxable brokerage gives you flexibility, but the highest form of flexibility is not simply I can withdraw whenever I want. It is I can manage how and when realization happens with intelligence. Dividends do not always ask your permission. Sales do. That does not make dividends bad. It simply means taxable account design should not be guided by emotional slogans like, I just want income, without asking what kind of income, under what tax treatment, in what stage of life, and for what purpose. This is where many investors sabotage themselves with covered call funds and high-yield strategies. They think they are simplifying retirement by building a portfolio that spits out cash. What they are often doing is sacrificing flexibility, possibly upside, and tax efficiency in exchange for a paycheck like sensation. Sensation is not the same as strategy. That is why I prefer the broad, disciplined, boring core. Boring is often a compliment in taxable investing. Boring means fewer bad surprises. Boring means more of the compounding belongs to you. Boring means you are less likely to wake up in 10 years and realize your account was designed more for emotional comfort than for economic endurance. And if I were speaking as plainly as possible, this is how I would summarize the entire file. A taxable brokerage is where after-tax compounding either gets protected or quietly bled. The best ETFs are not the highest yielding. They are the ETFs that let each essential job in the account get done with the least unnecessary tax drag and the most long-run discipline. That is why a serious taxable brokerage usually ends up looking remarkably unromantic. Some qualified dividend value, some intelligent cash management, a serious broad U.S. core, a modest international diversifier, broad growth engine, maybe a little aggressive exposure. If you truly know why it is there, that is enough. Enough to build, enough to stay sane, enough to avoid the most common errors, enough to make the account a tool for freedom rather than a theater for excitement. And I have always preferred freedom to theater.